Hi, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure for me to introduce Andrew Mollison to you today. But before I do that, I'd like to also mention that I have a guest here, and his name is Tom Ellis. He's in the front row here. He is on the waiting list to become an ICL member, and he's a Marion County Master Gardener with me and has actually started a big permaculture interest group within our Marion County Master Gardeners and rallied a lot of interest in this subject. And I was mentioning to someone earlier that I studied one of the handouts that he sent to me by email about planting blueberries, and I planted my 27 blueberry bushes according to the permaculture principles. Anyway, I'll tell you a little bit about Andrew. He's been studying, teaching, and practicing permaculture since he took his first design course in 1996. He started teaching permaculture at the college level in 2001 and has been an instructor at Oregon State University in the horticultural department since 2009. Andrew first learned permaculture in the drylands, where he studied at Prescott College for his undergraduate and master's degrees. In Arizona, his focus was on rainwater harvesting, gray water systems, and desert agriculture. He started a permaculture landscape design and build company and also worked in an ecologically based landscape architectural firm. In recent years, Andrew's focus has been more on broad-scale farm planning, permaculture, housing developments, and obtaining water rights. Andrew currently teaches the 4-credit courses, Permaculture Design course, and the Advanced Permaculture Design Tools for Climate Resilience on campus and online. Andrew teaches non-credit courses for the general public, with some being open source and freely available. He has produced 2 open source textbooks for his courses that are freely available as well. He hosts a podcast at www.earthrepairradio.com. And at a time that we're facing climate change, what better time to learn about how we can take better care of the earth? Welcome, Andrew.
All right, thanks very much. Should I stand here near the mic? Is that the best? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's nice to get off the highway instead of just passing through Salem and spend some time here. It's a lovely place. So how many people here feel like they're familiar with permaculture? They've heard a little bit about it or kind of could define it on their own? Okay. How many people thought they were coming to a class about hair care? Okay, a few of you, right? Okay, so somewhere in between, right? A couple of you. So we'll have the whole range of experience here. Yeah. So like Joyce said in the introduction, I have been involved in permaculture my entire adult life, really. So I took my first design course almost 25 years ago now. And I've been in Oregon for the last 11, and I've had the chance to, I studied permaculture in the desert, now in the temperate climates. I've had a chance to visit a lot of sites in other climates as well, in the tropics, and I've spent time in other places. And so I'm gonna, through this talk, try to give you a introduction to what permaculture is, and then give you somewhat of a world tour of different permaculture projects around the world, so you can see somewhat of the details of how this is being applied throughout the planet. So first off, permaculture, it began as permanent agriculture. Now, the founders of permaculture, who I'll get into here in a minute, during the environmental movement of the 1970s, became aware of the crisis of agriculture, the degradation of soils, depletion of water, destruction of habitat, and alteration of the climate from large-scale industrial agriculture. So at first, permaculture was seen as a solution to the agricultural issue, the ephemeral nature of an agriculture that depletes its resources by nature of its operation. But as time went on and the permanent agricultural system was developed, it was realized that you couldn't really have a permanent agriculture without having a culture to support it. So it became permanent culture, right? And so we think like permanent. I mean, permanent's a long time. It's really like enduring, resilient. So where conventional agriculture is depleting, like we said, soil, water resources, we're looking for an agriculture and a culture that actually increases natural resources by the nature of its design. So permaculture is an ethically based design system. And this is what differentiates permaculture from a lot of different for just like conventional design, is permaculture has ethics at its core. And the first ethic is care of the earth. The second is care of people, right? We want everybody in the world to be as happy as these folks here, trouncing across this mountain meadow with smiles on their faces, right? Why do children have to go to bed hungry, you know? So and also, if you're not caring for the people, then people will go to desperate measures to support themselves, which often means doing things that are not good for the earth. So you can't care for the earth without caring for the people. And then the third permaculture ethic talks about surplus, right? What do we do with surplus in a system? I mean, if you think about civilization, right? How did civilization start? We went from hunter-gatherers, where everybody pretty much had to work for their own sustenance. Everybody had to gather food. Once we started agriculture about 10,000 years ago, suddenly we started with having surplus, where we had merchants and artists and priests and soldiers and politicians, right? Maybe it would have been better off just sticking as hunter-gatherers there, but we didn't. And so what we do with our surplus as a society has a lot to do with how we live. And so in permaculture, we say we should reinvest surplus back into care of the earth and care of people. So I'm going to have your first pop quiz right here. I know we've just gotten started, but this here is a picture of people that are restoring a degraded riparian area. Okay, so you're going to think about I'm going to show you this image. I'm going to show you another image. You're going to tell me which one of these seems to represent reinvestment of surplus back into care of earth and care of people. Okay? Now, this is something else you could do with your surplus. You could buy a stretch Hummer or many other extravagant things. So I didn't see any stretch Hummers in the parking lot here, but does anybody think that the stretch Hummer is the reinvestment of surplus back into care of earth, care of people? Not one person? Okay, wow. This is a really smart group. You guys are all right. It's not the stretch Hummer. Restoring a degraded riparian zone would be a better example of reinvesting surplus back into care of earth, care of people, and really limiting consumption. That's something kind of hard for our society to grasp, is actually to place limits on consumption. So Bill Mollison was a real Renaissance man, where he did everything. He was a college professor, a logger, a trapper, an ecologist, a researcher, an author, and he actually came up with the permaculture design. I've read his biography, and he talks about, he came up with the permaculture design system actually in a moment of epiphany, in a way. Like, he saw it all in kind of one. He was like, we need to redesign everything. We need to have this whole system where we redesign everything. We learn how to design things that are not degrading natural systems, degrading our resources, but are actually increasing them. And so he was from Tasmania, and in his lifetime, he passed away in his 80s just a few years ago. In his lifetime, he actually saw Tasmania, which is that island just south of Australia, that's similar latitude in the southern hemisphere as us. He saw it go from somewhat of a sustainable system where people were living off the land in a kind of balanced way, and he saw it. He saw the forest get cut down. He saw the species go extinct, and he kind of saw the transformation. So he was very impacted by that from his childhood to his older life, and so. He started coming up with this permaculture design system. And that's the Permaculture Designer's Manual. That's sort of like the black book of permaculture. It's a big, thick book that he wrote, somewhat of the Bible. And And you can see this is one of his sites, his early research sites in Tasmania that he developed. And it doesn't look like an agricultural system. I mean, you can see a few little regular rows of crops and things, and you see these water harvesting. I'm going to grab my laser pointer, one sec. Just want to be able to point at things if I can. Oh, there we go. So you can see some regular rows of crops and such, and you see all this water storage, but overall this looks somewhat of a natural, it's not what we think of as a farm system. It's not what we think of as like an agricultural system. It looks a little more wild, right? Now, Bill, I'm going to read you a quote from Bill just so you get a little bit of a sense of his headspace, where he was thinking in his development of the permaculture design system. He said, "When we design, we're always building for future floods, future fires, future droughts, and planting a tree a few inches tall that will be future forest giants, throw future shadows. Future populations will need future soils and forest resources, shelter, security. So somebody needs to range ahead in time, scout out the next century. We are not daydreaming, we are time scouts, finding places now for what will be needed then." So I always tell my students this. I say, well, usually like kind of the first day, I say, if there's one thing I want you to leave here with is this new identity as a time scout, right? I mean, who's going to plant the old growth forests of the future, right? So, each one of you, now that you've heard, now you're all time scouts too. We'll have badges at the door as we leave here. I should actually make some time scout badges. David Holmgren was Bill's student, and where Bill ended up going, and he went all over the planet. He went to hundreds of countries, really a man on a mission. He went to some of the most devastated areas of the world and taught people, brought the permaculture design system, and figured out how in each of those places they could actually create a resilient system that was supplying food, water, shelter, building materials in a way that was regenerating ecosystems. So while Bill went all over the planet, David, his student who helped him write the book, he stayed home and he really worked out the design system and really kind of figured out the details of things. And this is his place here. It's called Miliadora, and this is in Australia. Again, Australia is the driest climate on Earth, so it's not really it's not a surprise that this is the place that that our system was really depleting the resources, because it's a fragile environment because of the aridity. So you can see again, there's some semblance of rows of trees there, and you can see this annual gardens with the house clustered in here, and you can see kind of forest and water collection. And this is you get a little bit of the aesthetic sense of permaculture, where it's like order, but there's also natural systems, and it's not in the same level of control, but nature is allowed to thrive within an agricultural system. So permaculture really begins with pattern observation, okay? Because the idea is that we're observing the patterns of nature, and we're seeing how does nature arrange things. So here we have the vascular system of a leaf, right? Can anybody see, does this pattern actually look like some other pattern in nature besides anybody? Spider web, okay. Dragonfly. Yeah, arteries, right? And the way that drainages, the creeks and rivers come together in a watershed. And in fact, it's the same pattern that we have our veins in our body, and it's the same pattern that the synaptic connections in our brain are as well. So it's like, we're like, okay, well, nature has made this pattern, and we keep seeing over and over again, this is the pattern that nature has made to transmit nutrients and water through space and time. So, how can we learn from the fact that this is how nature moves fluid through matter, right? And then this is a really example. This is the hardiest corn on the planet. This is the Hopi lands up in northeastern Arizona. So I lived in Arizona for 14 years and got to spend a lot of time in some of these areas here. And this corn here is not irrigated and not fertilized. It's planted a foot deep in the sand, right? And it's speculated that maybe it's fertilized by lightning strikes is how nitrogen is getting there, right? I mean, it's really amazing, the whole culture, the whole society is built out of this corn growing in these sandy lowlands here at 6,000 feet in the desert, right? So, you look at how have people and how do people live in places where they're not importing mass resources from across the planet, yet they've had thriving cultures and societies, and they've fed and grown populations for thousands of years. So what can we learn, right? What can be learned from how indigenous people have and do live that can help the whole world to make better choices? So we have this fundamental flaw that really permaculture is addressing. And the fundamental flaw is the fact that the divisions of landscape that we have, especially in America where we had the Land Ordinance Act of 1787 that basically put a grid over the entire landscape. So you look here, and I kind of highlighted where I saw roadways and I saw fence lines. I tried to highlight where it looked like the property boundaries were. But then you look beneath there and you can actually see this whole different pattern, the way that water flows and moves through the landscape. This is the confluence of the Marys River and Muddy Creek just south of Corvallis here. And I'll highlight, so you see this pattern below, the water flow pattern. The water flow pattern does not correspond with land division. So this is like this, I consider this the fundamental flaw of human civilization, is that we superimposed a grid over a non-gridded landscape, which means if you're this person right here, and this person right here is doing something that is harmful to you, whoops. Then you have no control over what the person upstream from you is doing. Basically, people can do what they want within their land unit. So, it was actually proposed early on that we divided the western states of the United States. It was John Wesley Powell, the founder of, or he was the one who Lake Powell is named after. Ulysses S. Grant sent him out to the western U.S. to survey the land. And he came back and said, we should divide the states and political boundaries of the western U.S. on watershed basins, on hydrologic units. Of course, we would have been a lot better off if, by the time he got back, Ulysses S. Grant had passed away. And so we ended up with the system we're in. But as permaculture designers, we're always, in how we're designing landscapes and working with water and soils and vegetation, we're always trying to address this fundamental issue. And you can see this here. This is San Francisco, and you can see, the hills and the valleys of San Francisco, and then you can see how this grid of streets really has no correspondence to landscape. And what happens is when you have these straight lines going down hills, when we put this grid on, all those streets become water conveyance channels. And the water is just dehydrated from the landscape through roadside ditches and sewer drainage ways. And so you can have a place like San Francisco or like Seattle that gets ample rain, and you've created a hydrologic desert. You've dried up the groundwater underneath these cities because the roadways are channeling the water out of the system as quickly as possible, right? And so this is kind of the condition that we are faced, that we're working with in permaculture. So we have this thing that I call the permaculture decision-making matrix. And it's basically how we design landscapes. We have these different elements that we look at in order to make choices. So it's like a way to make choices. So we start with topography. You can see the contour lines on this image, and topography really has to do with the shape of the land. It has to do with how water flows. It has to do with how soils are distributed. It has to do with the solar aspect. So one kind of slope is going to be facing north and it's going to be cooler. Another slope is going to be facing south or west. It's going to be hotter. It's going to be drier. Topography is a huge element that we assess in order to understand the conditions of a landscape. Next, we have a thing that we call the sectors. Now, the sectors map forces that come from outside of a site into a site. So the sun is a directional force we can map. We know where the sun rises in the wintertime, and we know where the sun is in the sky throughout the different seasons, and then where it sets, right? We have things like places where a potential wildfire might come from based on topography, based on wind direction and vegetation, slope. We have cold winds. We know that, a lot of times our really cold winds are from the north or the east here. And so we map the direction these different forces are coming into a site. And then our design becomes a response to those forces, right? So we're like, oh, we have cold winds from the north, and we don't need to maintain our solar access from the north. Maybe we should plant trees that are going to block the wind from the north. So we end up making decisions based on our analysis. And then we have a thing called the zones. And the zones say that in the center of, that each site has a center of human activity. So for most places, the house is the center of human activity. It's where people come in and out of all the time. And then we place items in the landscape in proximity to the center of human activity based on how often we need to visit those things. So the things that we need to visit the most, right, like our compost pile, our chickens, whatever it is in our yard that takes daily visits, we put that close. And then the farther we get from the center of the site, we put things that take less and less amount of maintenance. So it's just like efficiency of movement, basically. And then we have the principles. And the principles are a set of different guiding sort of sayings that we use to design. And we'll get into the principles a little bit later. And this is basically, this right here is the core of the permaculture design system. So, we start with site analysis. And permaculture it's information intensive. It's really heavy on site analysis. And the idea is that you really figure out what's going on with a site. Like we said, you're looking at the wind, you're looking at water, soils, solar aspect, fire danger, all these different things. And your design is based on this information. So here we have this is a sector diagram. And we're showing all of these directional forces. So you can see this is noise from the neighbors, right? Winter sun. This would be the summer sunset, water drainage, pleasant view, cold winter winds, distant road noise, visitors, pleasant view. And so we figure out all the forces, and then we figure out, oh, I want to respond to these forces. Like, for example, here's a little question for you guys. We've got noisy neighbors to the south, yet we have our winter sun. So we would say, so what do we want to do with noisy neighbors? How would we want to respond to noisy neighbors? Right, okay. Then we have to do our sector analysis of our prison cell, of course. But in the event of a non-Mad Max situation, what do we do with our Yeah, we want to block them in some way, right? But then what do we want to do with the winter? What do we want to do with the winter sun sector? Yeah, so maybe, so we want to somehow do something. So in the wintertime, so we'd say what feature simultaneously could block our noisy neighbors, yet keep our site open for the winter sun? And I heard all kinds of people yell out all sorts of things, and I think, yeah, deciduous trees or like a low evergreen hedge, but basically a short barrier. So this is just the kind of thought process we go through with the sector, in responding to the sectors. And then the zones, so this is David Holmgren's place here, and I'm going to talk about the zone. So zone 1 here, you can see this area is where the house is. It's where there's intensive gardens. It's a workshop. And this is really the area that just receives like daily or more than daily, kind of almost constant maintenance. Ideally in zone 1, you're sort of living in and out. You're interacting with the outside a lot. Zone 2 is considered the home orchard, where you have fruit and nut trees that are diverse. They're for home use and they're highly maintained, something that you might do a lot of pruning on, fruit thinning, that kind of thing. Zone 3 is considered more like the cash crop area. So on his zone 3 here, you can see rows of trees. They're diverse trees, but they're still managed in rows, and there's grazing that happens up and down. There's water collection in zone 3, and this is more where he might get a surplus of goods that is for sale, or enough that's going to share with their neighbors, or maybe make money from zone 3. And then zone 4 is semi-managed. So semi-managed, so it might be managed for fire break, right, or firewood, or mushroom, maybe go harvest mushrooms. Now this site doesn't have a zone 5. Zone 5, as you get farthest away from the site, it's wilderness. It's area that you don't touch at all. But because this area here is in a Australia high wildfire danger area, there's no part that is not managed for fire protection, basically. So that's a little snippet of the zone model. Now the design principles, I'm not really going to go into them because we would spend the whole rest of our talk talking about the design principles. But the design principles talk about how we fit the different pieces of a system together so they work symbiotically, right? So things like catch and store energy, obtain a yield, observe and interact, produce no waste. They're like these different guiding sentences here. Now, we have different manifestations of this design system. Now, the permaculture is a design system. It is not a set of techniques, right? So people think like, oh, I'm doing a permaculture thing, right? Like, oh, so there are certain techniques that tend to come up a lot in permaculture, that permaculture is known for, but it's more like these techniques are arrived at through the permaculture design process as opposed to being permaculture themselves. But that being said, the food forest, right? The permaculture food forest is a big one, because we see that we have these forests out there in the world that receive no human input. Nobody's coming and fertilizing the old growth Doug fir forests that we have here in the Coast Range, yet they seem to be thriving without external inputs. So we're like, how could we actually mimic our own systems after some of the structure that we find in a forest? So we try to like mimic a forest, but have a forest that actually is producing food for us. So we'd select the varieties, fruits, nuts, all sorts of things. We use plants a lot to actually create fertility. So nitrogen-fixing plants. There are nitrogen-fixing, people think of cover crops, they think of clover and faba beans and buckwheat and such, but there's also nitrogen-fixing shrubs, nitrogen-fixing trees that can be planted perennial fertility in a system. So that's another design feature we use a lot in permaculture. Multistoried gardening. This is a picture I took in Kerala, India, where probably the black pepper that you used on your omelet this morning came from. And these are pepper vines climbing up jackfruit and coconut trees, right? And we look at these indigenous systems and we see that, especially places like in the tropics, people have been doing multi-storied production, where we go out, we drive through the valley, we see hazelnut trees, and we see everything's like sort of two-dimensional. There's a tree crop and then nothing underneath. And we're like saying, well, in a forest, there's actually multi-layered production. So how can we mimic our systems after that? And then in our climate, as we get farther from the equator, right, and we get here, you guys, I think the 45-degree line passes right through Salem. I think that's very auspicious. So Salem is exactly halfway between the North Pole and the equator, right? So the farther that you get from the equator, the more your design really needs to center around harvesting heat and sunlight. So you take a pattern like this forest garden pattern where we've got different stories. We've got tall trees and low trees and shrubs and herbaceous perennials and ground covers and root crops and mushrooms, all in this, multi-species polycultural system. And then you take that and you make it into a sun trap. So we've got tall tree layer, low trees, shrubs, herbaceous perennials. And then here in the middle, so you get that winter, that low winter sun is hitting all these trunks and actually concentrating light in the center. It's the same thing here. This is little keyhole gardens. But the arrangement of these trees here, the architecture of the plants is actually concentrating light in the center, and then you might have a pond or a lawn or an annual vegetable garden. Like here, there's an annual vegetable garden in the center of this solar arc. So this solar catcher's mitt is another really popular pattern that we see used in our particular climate in permaculture systems. Oops. And then the reuse of only mildly dirty water, right? Gray water. This is up in Portland right here. And these ornamental bananas are thriving from the gray water from an adjacent kitchen, right? So, we're washing clothing, we're taking showers, and especially if we use detergents that are, that are biocompatible or that'll break down into something that's not harmful to plants, we've got this water source that we're just basically spending energy to treat and then sending back in the water, in the rivers. Right, so using gray water is something that we see, and water recycling, water reuse, we see that a lot in permaculture systems around here. And then, when we go to urban areas, we're talking about maximizing the use of space. So this is my friend's rooftop here in Portland, where they have a living roof. They've got solar panels, energy production on the roof. They've got all these different plants. They've got grapevines coming up, and there's this whole incredible diversity of both food plants as well as things for habitat. They kept their bunny up there, kind of hop around the roof, because there's not a lot of raptors in Southeast Portland, right? So, when we have a lot of different scales that we see permaculture applied at, and this would be some strategies in the urban area. And then we also see a lot of art and beauty, because people that practice permaculture, typically when you're caring for the earth and caring for the people and reinvesting your surplus back into care of the earth and care of the people, then oftentimes you're inspired to do something beautiful as well, whimsical. So it's not a rule of permaculture, but it tends to be a trend in permaculture. And then, creating usable materials. Actually, I came in and I didn't know where the auditorium was, and I ended up wandering all through this complex here. And it was really nice, and I guess because it's the Japanese university, it was really nice to see the stands of bamboo in the middle of the common areas there, right? And that's really, people have a bamboo phobia a lot, but it was nice to see a lack of, I don't have a bamboo phobia personally, and then this is a nice example of the beauty and utility of bamboo. So this is actually, I took this picture in, I think that was in Jodhpur, India. And the bamboo, and the thing I didn't get the picture of is the ladders. So here we think ladders, we think metal. In India, they think ladders, bamboo. Everybody has bamboo ladders. They sell them on the side of the street, these long, tall ladders made out of bamboo. So, creating materials that can be used, or even just used for compost, even just used for biomass, just sequestering carbon and taking, and growing material that ends up helping out with soil fertility, but growing materials in our systems that are usable. That also goes for firewood, it goes for craft wood, it goes for all different timber products as well. So we're going to look at some of the scales that we find permaculture systems at. This is in Prescott, Arizona, where I used to live. And this is a before shot. Here's the before and then after shot of a south-facing backyard we did. This woman, Carol Oldershaw here, she gardened. She grew her first garden at 72 years old, and because she was concerned about the world and the earth and everything like that. So you can see in this small urban lot, we've got gutters leading to a rainwater collection tank. We have another one that you can't see out of the picture here. We've got a chicken coop. We put this raised garden bed built out of stone. And so this south face here and this water tank and this other water tank on this side act again as this solar collector, heat reflector. And then all the stone of this garden bed made it so she had this extremely long growing season in her yard because of the microclimate development that we did. Right? So we planned it all in order to enhance that microclimate. She had about a 3-week longer on either side growing season as a garden that would be out in the open. So she had about 6 weeks longer of a growing season because of this microclimate development that we did at our house. And then on the north side, the water from an adjacent building went and we created a basin. We created a little miniature food forest as well. So, a lot of production can happen in a small amount of space. How many people have driven around Portland and bumped into something like this? Right? A few of you. So this is how permaculture can manifest in public space. This is the City Repair Project in Portland, where they've actually taken these intersections and created community zones for people to gather and put benches and little miniature libraries, and they have a little tea station here. They keep hot water up, and then you can come and get tea here, and there's a community gardens around there, and they've actually, you might say, fertilized the social environment by just making gathering spaces in a neighborhood that didn't have public space. Right? So that's a way that we kind of see permaculture on the social level in public spaces. And then we have really high density urban systems here. This is Oakland, California. This is the Top Leaf Farm. And this is a trend in places like the Bay Area where they're actually, when they're putting in new residences, they realize this, what do people want? They want open space, they want gardening, and they're putting in rooftop gardens and really maximizing this hyper-dense urban space, balcony gardens, micro gardens in small areas to be able to have habitat and food production even in cities, right? And then we see applied to just housing development. So this is a design. I actually drew this for a low-income senior housing facility. This is in Prineville in Eastern Oregon. And, I didn't change anything about the buildings, the building orientation. The people who were designing this and developing the site already understood solar design, passive solar design, and how they have those buildings or elongated east to west. They have a big side of them facing south for passive heat gain and light. But what I did do was fill in the landscape here where all of the water from these buildings is going to water different fruit trees and different habitat areas. And we created community gathering area, community garden beds here, and then a wastewater treatment zone. So all of the wastewater from these facilities could also be treated and used on site beneficially. This is another low-income senior housing facility that I helped design, and this one's in Lapine, Oregon. Lapine, anybody familiar with Lapine? I mean, Lapine can freeze like any day of the year. I mean, when you look at the analogous climate to Lapine around the world, it's like Upper Mongolia has the same temperature and precipitation as Lapine here. So we really, I came in after they had already done this unit and they were building this unit, and they had the parking lot proposed due south of the apartment complex. And I said, that's your one microclimate that you actually can do some sort of horticulture here. So we put the parking lot in the north side, and we created a water collection basin on the front with fruit trees and other trees here, and we took their garden bed. They had their garden beds over here where they're going to be shaded by this tall 2-story building. We put all their garden beds right here in the front, and this actually got built out. This is an early photo when it was first planted. I haven't gotten a picture since it's really grown out, but you can see here water collection tanks. This is the south side. We created this little pocket here that's going to get this nice radiant heat from the building. And then this pathway where the residents come out here. And these are seniors who are like homeless, basically. So this is a place for housing houseless seniors. So, a lot of these people are really gracious to just have a place, and they wanted to give them something to do. So these gardens, and I walked out, when I toured this and took this picture, people came out, oh, what are you doing? Looking out on the balconies, right? So we combined the social flows within this community with horticultural aspects and hobbies and gardening to actually create this richness that really is there. The richness is only there because of the way that we arrange things. This was planned to be a parking lot right there, due south. This is thought as one of the most impressive permaculture developments in the world. This is in Davis, California. Anybody been to Village Homes? Right, a few of you. Yeah, this place, this community, well, all of the houses are oriented, so they're east to west elongated, facing south, so they get the passive solar warmth and heat in the wintertime. And then all of the water, all the runoff goes between the houses. Every other row is a big giant swale, a big sunken area with community pathways, and they planted it super densely with fruit trees and every kind of edible food. I mean, this is Central California, the Central Valley. I mean, you can grow practically anything there. This place is planted so densely with food that you can go and you can walk along the paths there, and you just close your eyes and you open your mouth, and food just falls in your face, right? It's really, really nice. Yeah, this is actually a picture of what it looks like in there, and that's one of the sunken water collection swales. And now, the people that actually oppose this development, they said, no, don't build anymore, don't build anymore. Who would possibly not want to build any more of these beautiful developments? Anybody have a guess? Yeah? No? The realtors. Because nobody moved. Nobody would move. Nobody moves, so nobody sells houses. So that's not good for a real estate business. So we see a lot of examples at the farm and homestead level, and this is where permaculture really shines. This is a farm in Normandy, France, a well-known permaculture site. And again, I mean, you see, like, there's this artistry in the way that these beds are designed. There's greenhouses, there's water collection areas, there's intensive gardens, homes, these pathways coming through. I mean, this is like an agricultural ecosystem, right? And there's all these little micro relationships within this of how the compost is moved from here to there, and what's planted by what, and how animals are moved through, and the solar design. I mean, this is this intricate system. It's an intricate web, right? That is like this really represents kind of the level that people can get to when they start to use the permaculture design system. This is a design I did. This is just a 1 acre. This is in Beaver Creek, Oregon, where, we just put water collection orchards, and they were building a new home here with gardens, and just making this, again, like this kind of complex, interesting, and beautiful arrangement of the different elements that someone wants in a landscape. This is a larger scale here. This is Wolf Gulch Farm. This is down the Little Applegate Valley. So it's near Rouge. Anybody know that area? It's quite dry. So this is about they get about 12 inches a year. It's very arid. And this is about, they wanted to create a farm that was just on the edge, like to really push the limits of how productive they could be in this harsh ecosystem, in this harsh climate. So they have water collection off all the surfaces, and they actually take a spring and divert the spring water to this pond here. They collect all the water running down this road. The reason this is such a straight road here, this was actually a drug smuggling secret airstrip. that they converted into this farm. So all the water's funneled into here, and with the arrangement of the different beds and tree rows, they actually are draining frost off of this property. They're harvesting water, and they're having protection against desiccating winds. See, and this is a picture here of Tom Ward and that big pond down below. This is another seed farm here. This is in Williams, Oregon. And again, we've got water collection, we've got perennials mixed with annuals here. This is Siskiyou seeds and these little areas here. And this whole landscape is hydrated by this water collection. And the people below this landscape have actually had their spring levels and their well levels actually rise since this water retention landscape was installed above them. And this is the work of Don Tipping, and this is a really thriving place that a lot of people have visited. This is in Wisconsin. That's kind of a before shot, and this is this is an organically planned, farm scale system here with nut trees. They do a lot of annual crop raising, and they raise different pigs. They actually, all these rows in here, a lot of them are mixed rows of different nuts. So we think of harvesting hazelnuts, and we think of these rows, and you have to have the machinery. Well, here, they don't harvest the hazelnuts with machinery. They harvest their hazelnuts with pigs. So they can have irregular rows because they're not running equipment down. They're just running the pigs through, and then the pigs are living this glorious life there, except for that one really horrible day that they have. But other than that, it's like paradise for them. Let's see. That's another shot of his farm there. I think I'm almost at the point where I can wrap up this first section here. This is another one of Mark Sheppard's pictures there. This is in Austria. This is a famous place by another guy named Sepp Holzer, and you can see the integration of ponds, water collection, all of these terraces throughout here with all of these mixed crop, and you've got tree systems, you've got areas that look more like their annual agriculture, and you have this mosaic of ponds, forests, meadows, annual agricultural zones, and it's like this mixed cropping that creates all this edge for ecosystems to exist simultaneous to agriculture. This is a shot here, a close-up shot of that place, and these are his fish ponds. This was an old sand quarry that they use permaculture principles, and this is just the model of what it's supposed to look like, to basically do ecological restoration and bring this sand quarry back to being a functional ecosystem after it's been strip mined. So we see permaculture used in ecological restoration. We see permaculture used in refugee and disaster situations, right? So this is many refugee camps never stop being refugee camps. They are refugee camps for decades, right, and longer, and some become permanent settlements. So there's a lot of permaculture people working with refugee services, camp design for food production within refugee camps. And then this is really like a region-wide project. This is one of the biggest projects they did in the world, and this is in Zimbabwe. It's the Chukukwa project, and you can see these vegetated contour swales. They did this on this entire watershed, thousands of people with multiple villages involved, to restore the water table that was dropping in this area. So by doing small-scale water harvesting, they actually restored the water access in this level. And then this is the project I'm going to end on, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions real quick. This is in Saudi Arabia. Now, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for whatever reason, decided that they did not want nomadic Bedouin people to move around anymore, right? And so they decided they wanted to settle nomadic Bedouin people. So they talked to some permaculture people. How can we create a system that can both feed and bring economic livelihood for these nomadic people? And so this is an area, this is south of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, that gets about between 0 and 3 inches of rainfall a year. Hyper arid. So they basically, these rocky hills here, they made it so whenever they do get these big episodic rain events, all the water is harvested in these vegetated water harvesting swales. And then they tried different trees from all over the planet to try to find species that would thrive there and live just on the rainfall, as well as provide food or some sort of economic yield. And so this is what those vegetative swales look like. And then, so they got everything established with irrigation based on how much water they were soaking in when it rained. And then they cut the irrigation off. And then it didn't rain there for a year and a half. There's no rain. And they just went back and they found that they have 4 tree species that survived, 2 of them which actually have a fruit or a yield that they could then use. This is a little, like an image of what their, this is a computer drawing of what they were imagining their system to look like. And they also imagined that scaling up this system here, this is the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula here, and this is where that's taking place. And the idea is, now that they've figured out a way that they could get trees established in this whole microclimate with no extra water, they could actually vegetate. They could revegetate this entire area with that, and then doing mangroves in the coast. And what that would do is it would put more nuclei that exude from the trees up into the atmosphere for raindrops to form around. So the idea is that if you actually reforest large areas, that you create the conditions for more rain to fall in those areas, and actually you would bring more rain into the interior continent. So this is one example, but we find the same potential for actually rehydrating landscapes and working with atmospheric moisture in a lot of different places in the world. So that's kind of, I just wanted to end with this sort of like scaled up macro view of, where, we go from gardening system to like region-wide climate alteration, and that's kind of the big view. So got some time for questions real quick. And we have, thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Karen. I am really, really interested in the one you showed. I'm not sure if it was Lapine or if it was a picture close to that, where it was a homeless and senior center type development.
Yeah.
So it would be people without much money.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to develop something around it that isn't going to cost them money to take care of, right?
Yeah. And also this is a state funded, this is like state low income housing. So the state is paying basically people's rent, and they have a certain budget that the developers work within, but they're trying to put in a low maintenance.
This is what this is going to be that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
What I'm interested in is they wanted to put a, quote, park in around it, and I thought for low-income people that would be too expensive to take care of, but I liked this. So you're planting trees, and there wouldn't be any maintenance on those, supposedly?
Yeah, eventually. You have, anything in the early stages, there's maintenance to get it going, but once you have trees going, depending on what kind of tree you plant.
And what was below the trees?
The trees we planted in here?
Uh-huh.
A lot, it's hard to find actually fruiting varieties in Lapine just because it's so late freezing. So, we ended up planting like different crabapple species
I
and
just
things
meant
are fun.
theoretically, after the trees, you had something in there.
Theoretically, you would do all different mixed fruit trees, so you had some food yield or something that created a yield or habitat benefit. Yeah.
This is Rosamond. How do you get the pigs to harvest the hazelnuts?
Have you ever seen they hook these they put them like a chair, sort of like a chariot, and no, I'm just kidding. The pigs just eat the hazelnuts. You just have fencing, and the pigs just go and they just eat the nuts on the ground. because hazelnuts typically they fall to the ground when they're ready. So this is it's based after a system that was originated in Spain called the Dehesa system, where they have acorn finished ham. It's very expensive, very prized. And so they have a system where they have nut trees interspersed sort of with meadows and oak trees, and pigs are run through there and they eat and they finish off on the nut, and then it becomes very high quality. That taste sort of becomes infused in the ham. And so it's very high quality and very esteemed in that region, I know. Yeah, actually I heard a whole NPR story about this ham once, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm curious, if I tripped across a permaculture homestead or subdivision, how would I be able to distinguish that from an upscale community that pays attention to the environment?
Well, I don't know what an upscale community that pays attention to the environment necessarily looks like. Or I'm not sure how many of those there are per se. But I think in permaculture, you'd look for diversity and productivity. And it could be that you find a well-planned upscale community that pays attention to the environment that was planned by someone who understood the permaculture principles. I think it's kind of hard to distinguish unless you know the specific story of that place and who designed it and what their intentions were. But you could certainly recognize some of the things I showed, like attention to solar aspect, water collection, that water was being infiltrated, productive species being planted, probably minimization of things like turf, unlike things that were sort of high maintenance, low productivity landscape uses. Yeah.
This is Kathleen. I am curious about Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And is this a long-range plan they have for converting the desert into livable space, or is it just a trial right now?
Well, that first 100-acre site I showed you was so successful that they then moved over to a adjacent site that's 5,000 acres to bump the trial up. Now, I know that I'm only hearing about this secondhand from the people who are involved in it, because it's actually an American guy who is the one who has been the main project lead on that. But the main goal was, like I said, to settle nomadic people. But I think that as it's showing itself, I think that from what I've heard, them, and also I've heard that Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula have been interested in the effects of forestation on rainfall. And so I don't know, I would hope that it's starting to click in some of these governments that certainly have the financial resources to pull something like that off, like Saudi Arabia, yeah.
Oh, hi. Oh, okay, my turn. How do you get these developers that put up houses like mushrooms in the rain to buy into that? What incentive can you offer them?
Yeah, well, I mean, financially, the incentive to the buyer is huge, because if your development is oriented for passive solar, your heating bills are going down, your electricity bills are going down, and your cooling bills are going down because you're working with the sun. If you are like a lot of these developers, they have to spend for drainage anyway. It's not actually more costly to do drainage in a way where you're doing water harvesting instead of dehydrating the landscape. It's just how you orient things. So I would say, like in Oregon right now, the main thing probably for these developers would be this is what your buyers want. And if you could actually advertise your development as, solar responsible with lower bills and water responsible, more drought proof, for example, then, maybe you can even offer more of a premium on your units, or at least sell them next to a not well done development.
This is relatively similar to that question, but if you have an already developed area, roughly what expense would a person need to go to or expect to go into this?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that we call them type 1 errors. So if you have a structure that is poorly oriented for the sun, there's not a whole lot you can do. I mean, the expense is so great to try to retrofit. So, to some degree, it depends on what you're starting with. I mean, I live in a home that was built in 1937. Now, I picked a home that was auspiciously oriented with, because I had this in my mind. However, most of the work that you do as a permaculture designer is retrofitting. And so, the retrofitting really, it's sort of a luck of the draw of what conditions you're starting with. And like I said, kind of in the beginning, a lot of when you're retrofitting, you're oftentimes working with very dysfunctional water drainage that is dehydrating the landscape. So I'm trying to remember exactly what the question was now. How can anybody afford it? Well, I mean, you start right outside your kitchen door. And you start by planting the herbs that you use on a regular basis in your cooking. So you can go out of your door and you can just put your slippers or your flip-flops on. You can be cooking soup. You can go out and you can clip some rosemary and run back in and not burn your soup or not burn your eggs. So, I mean, you can just start very humbly in your own place, and it kind of builds. So once you put your culinary herbs right outside your kitchen door, then what's next? And so most people that are doing permaculture around the world actually are not doing this with a lot of money. I mean, I showed some high-end examples, but the majority of people are just putting the pieces together and saying, wow, my sink or my shower is draining out and creating a mess right here, like people without plumbing, especially in a lot of parts of the world. Wow, I could actually create a mulch-filled basin and plant banana trees here instead. So for a lot of people, we're not actually talking about expense. However, for the most part, a lot of the expense is up front when you're talking about major infrastructural changes, and then those systems start to work for you and become productive. So it's very site-specific, very specific to the circumstance.
Drew, thank you very much for a very interesting first half. And I think we could fill the second half with our questions, but we'll leave it to you as to how we break that up.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Great, thank you. All right. I didn't know what kind of crowd this was going to be, so I thought I put this picture up here for break, but I guess I kind of misread things. Sorry about that. Yeah. Where? Oh, I don't know. I just searched for punks on break or something like that. I found that. Yeah. Okay. So this actually is going to answer some of the questions. So now for this next section, I'm just going to go through specific examples from all over the world to try to give you a wide breadth of how permaculture is being applied in different situations. So this is the before shot. Now this is Columbia Eco Village, and you see these buildings here. This is the old shot. So this is just a traditional apartment complex like you'd see anywhere. And these folks came and they bought it. It was for sale, and they turned it into this eco village. Yeah, I know those before and after shots. I'll just do that again just so you can enjoy that. Look at that. Wow, that's the dream right there. So you can see they replaced the roofs, probably with good material for water harvesting. All the parking lot waters going into these vegetated swales here, harvesting water from the parking lot and with beautiful vegetation all around. They put this big community garden area in here. And then they just planted all this forest, and this is sort of food forest, different native trees and food trees. They built a community center, and this site's interesting because I have a rainwater harvesting online course that I teach, so I went and I did a video of this site here, and they collect water from many of these roofs, and they actually have a centralized water collection system with about 40,000 gallons of rainwater storage. And they use that, and they pretty much water this garden with collected rainwater from the roofs. And it's very lush and beautiful there. It's really nice. So this is a neat example of what do you do when you're not starting from scratch. You're starting with an existing dysfunctional, just regular old apartment complex, right? So one more time you get to see that. I know, it's exciting. And then here is, this is just an image of what it looks like to live there now. Of course, they painted it nice, and you can see they put the roof on. There's gardens everywhere, and they transition the spaces in interesting ways. So there's diversity. So now we're going to jump down to the Santa Fe area, and this is okay. So I had another question on the break about, is permaculture just a repackaging of indigenous ways? And the answer is yes, right? That basically in Western culture, we forgot how to live in a way that is not depleting our resources. And many indigenous cultures are just practicing what we would call permaculture. Now, there are a lot of interesting hybrids now of indigenous cultures that are losing, or they still have some of their traditional knowledge, but then they're intersecting permaculture, and they are working to restore their traditional knowledge and also bring in some other permaculture type of technologies and things that had never not been used traditionally by them. So there's some really interesting hybridization going on. But this is an old project, and this is actually on Indian Pueblo in the Rio Grande River Valley. And you can see the surrounding areas are barren. And this is about a 30-year-old permaculture project where they've established all this vegetation and gardens, water harvesting, really improved the structures, and it looks a little something like that in there, and done this fine crafting. And in a desert environment, again, Santa Fe, it's very harsh. It's 7,000 feet, very cold. Right? It's high desert is one of the most difficult climates on the planet to have a productive system in, but centralizing their water collection, gray water, and creating this oasis here. This is a UK version, and this is a farm in UK. And the thing that I love about the UK, I went to the International Permaculture Conference in the UK, and when you fly over, you can see their field divisions. You fly over the US, you look at the Willamette Valley, and everything is these grids, and it's difficult because it's not, my favorite word is geomorphic, which is conforming to the shape of the land. So you go to a place like the UK where the property divisions are old, and we have more of a geomorphic design base, to work within. So here they're just taking their existing plot here and then creating basically perennially based systems. So perennial plants as the main structural piece. Here's another picture of that from the air, so we can see the idyllic British landscape. And then this is a nice example of and what does, can you pick which one of these is the permaculture property, right? So that would be right next to this little idyllic village there. And this is another close-up there. So natural building is another element that we see a lot in permaculture systems. This is a before shot, and this is Australia. And this was a family ranching property. And the guy who inherited this, the son or the grandson, he ended up getting into permaculture and keyline design. And so he took their grazing property and kept it as a grazing property, but put in these series of ponds, and each pond has an associated roadway, and the roadways are all part of the water harvesting system. So these roads and everything is laid out for the topography. So the way that you get around the farm, the roads are sloped and oriented, so all the water that falls on these roads is being harvested in these small ponds dotting the landscape. And what this has done is it's created these different land units, different landscape, land management units in between the roadways. So they're doing rotational grazing, and now they have a water source in each part of the pond for the cattle and then chickens and such to drink from, and then they've created this infrastructure to move them around based on the road. So it's like water and access in a system, they're married. Like, you start with figuring out where you're gonna do your water storage, and then your access is built around that. And so here the access becomes the water harvesting device in a way. And you can see this is that same property here. So you can see how these roadways are also ditches that are harvesting water into these ponds. And here, this is you can see the rotational chicken system. This is a little chicken hut here, and these are all chickens, and then this is a little electric fence right here, and so that's just moving its way across the landscape, right? In conjunction with the movement of cattle, basically. So they have like this rotational system going on. So Australia, so this fellow P.A. Yeomans actually, before permaculture, developed this system called the Keyline Design System, and he's considered the second most important person in Australian agriculture. I don't know who the first most important person in Australian agriculture is, but I know who the second is. And he designed this whole system based on water collection and creating different lines across the landscape where tree belts and roadways are all working in conjunction with water collection. So this is kind of what this was built in the 1950s. So this is a 60, 70-year-old system now, and there's a number, these systems are all over Australia that have actually gotten richer as time has gone on, right? The trees have grown, the soils have improved, and this really time-tested way that a lot of the landscapes that we see using this keyline system are very similar topographically to the Willamette Valley, to our gently sloping hills and deep soils. We really could have a system that looked a lot more like this. And this is a zoom in here. You can see, so this is silvopasture, meaning they're combining so grazing properties with tree production, with timber production. But silvopasture is when you combine animals with cropping, basically. So these are silvopastoral systems. This is Portugal, and this is a before shot right here. And this was a community, and it was like it was kind of a eco-village, sort of intentional community type of place. And they had all these people living here, but they were running out of water. It was very dry there, and some people might know Portugal has very bad wildfires, it's similar climate to Northern California. And so the same guy that did the place in Switzerland, he came and he put in these big lakes here, and he put water retention landscaping all around. He put these big lakes in the middle of the community. So all the water, instead of running down this valley here, it stopped in the lakes and it soaked into the groundwater table. And basically, it turned it into this, and that edge at the lake was this exceptionally rich zone. So you got all this water, you got all this edge and habitat, and then the water soaks in, and because it's not rushing out of the system, because now it's soaking in, it builds the groundwater table, and then you have groundwater resources. Right? And I've seen this all over the world, actually. Now, I mentioned the Keyline Design System. So this is a vineyard and a forestry project, and this is in Australia. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of the diagramming of how this is designed. So this is what they call the main ridge that just showed up in red. So that's like it's sort of like your knuckles. Like this is the main ridge. And then coming down, we have what are called the primary ridges. So these are like your fingers. And then in between the primary ridges, we have the primary valleys, right? So that's the space between your fingers, or those blue lines right there. And then right at the point where the slope goes from steep to gentle is where they put the water storage ponds. And then when these ponds, so when this pond fills up, it doesn't spill down the valley. The water actually goes around the slope to the next pond. And then the water goes around the slope to this ridge, and then around the slope to this ridge pond. So they're keeping water at this high point in the landscape so they can gravity irrigate these areas down below. So this is all a vineyard right here, and this is forestry. And then the rows are oriented in a way that the rows are pointing down slope from the valley form to the ridge form. So when water moves in this landscape, it's actually spread from the valleys, from the low points, actually spread out towards the ridges for a more even distribution of water over the whole landscape. So there's more water soaking in. So instead of having like wet valleys and dry ridges, you have a more even soaking. So that's the, and I know that might be tricky for some people to understand in this really short little soundbite, but that's the essence of this keyline system that this guy P.A. Yeomans developed over in Australia. And so permaculture took a lot of information from this keyline system, and they borrow from each other a bit. Well, I don't know that keyline borrows from permaculture, but permaculture certainly borrows from keyline. This is a Google Earth image here of a property in Mexico, Rancho San Ricardo, Mexico, that was developed, again, these roadways, so you got the valleys, valley, where these lines dip in. So the roadways and the whole property is sloped, so the water is being diverted to the ridges. And this is what that place actually looks like on the ground. So you get this system that's not losing soil to erosion. It's soaking water in more evenly across the landscape. And then you have this, and then you're planting trees and perennials along with your annuals. So it's like, it's an agricultural system that actually is working in conjunction with the shape of the land, the movement of water, the distribution of soils, and then wildlife movement. You're creating wildlife corridors. There's a lot of wildlife that doesn't like to move through empty space. So you're making sure that creatures can get through. So, combination of perennials and annuals. I mean, that looks like a park. Right? There's nothing that's not productive about this farm. I mean, it's a nice example in a little more of a tropical climate. So this next slide, we're going to go and we're going to see a little more of an aid relief project. So this is Tanzania here on the east side of Lake Victoria, where I have that pin. So we zoom in here. So this is Lake Victoria. And there was these orphans in this community, and they wanted to help the people that were taking on these orphans. They wanted to give them the opportunity to grow more food so they could support taking on these orphans. So they had this project developed. Let's see. Yeah. This orphans garden here. And the first thing they did was they assessed the water flow coming down the slope, and it's coming right through the site. You can see this is pretty much just farmland here that's not covered in trees, so the water's going to move more quickly across there. And so they started, sorry, I need to wait for these little animations. They started with a site, and like I said, they mapped the water flow coming through the site. And so it started with a blank slate, right? And they just had these drainage that was coming through the site like this. So they designed the site to take full advantage of that water flow. And again, you're starting to see the similarity of what a lot of these permaculture sites look like. We've got these undulating rows of crops here. We have water bodies right here. We have a building. It looks like there's some sort of social or gathering area over here. And, the assessment on a site like this is different than in our hemisphere or our climate, because near the equator, we're not designing for sun because the sun is fairly constant throughout the year. So really, in the equator, the main elements that were being designed for in this site was the water flow and then the airflow, the cooling winds off of the lake. So that's how they oriented the buildings. And so they really designed the site, based on that water flow so they could make maximum use when the rains did come and would go through this site. So this was this is the path that they moved the water through the site. So this runoff comes here, it hits this big swale and is diverted around the building, and it comes down here, and then it zigzags back this way into this pond area, and then it kind of zigzags back and forth into this wetland and then into the lake. So they're making the most that they can out of the little water flow they get during heavy rains. A windmill pumps up water from the pond into a tank for irrigation up above. So, projects like this end up being collaborations between the people that are locals, and then they get in touch with different NGOs and such that will support a project like this. And so I know about this project because a friend of mine who's a permaculture guy in Santa Fe, he does natural building, and they actually brought him out to help build this structure. And they went and they made the bricks themselves, and they really designed the site. And then, I'll show you a little overlay of the zone model here. So we talked about the zones. And, right around the building, we had that zone 1, the area of the highest traffic, where they have composting toilets. So they're actually not defecating in water. They're composting it because they don't have the water resources or the water treatment resources for that. And then they have their intensive food forest, that's zone 2. Then they have intensive low-profile gardens, semi-managed wetlands, plants for forage, and then aquaculture. They're raising fish in the pond. And then zone 5 is this unmanaged shoreline marsh. Now, this project was so successful that they were given another site nearby that they turned into a tree nursery to grow hundreds of thousands of trees to plant throughout the rest of the region. So a lot of times, some little seed project like that, and I encourage people to actually, there's a lot of projects that could use sponsorship, especially from people in the US. Your dollar will go very far in a place like this. A lot of projects like that, once they get established, they become seed projects for larger projects. So that's what we're seeing in a lot of different countries. This is another one from the US. This is on the Hopi reservation, Hopi Tutskwa Permaculture. And here, they actually used to have government housing, like a big trailer brought in, and people stopped building more traditional structures. And so they got rid of their trailer and they built cob houses. So they used mud and sand and clay and built these organic houses there. And they started a project where they were taking restoring their heirloom seed varieties, their traditional seed varieties, and also their traditional fruit tree varieties. We don't necessarily think of fruit trees as being native to Arizona because, our fruits like the peach and the apple and everything came over with colonization. However, the Spaniards came and brought peaches up, and they developed the missions up the Rio Grande River Valley. They built the missions, and then there was the Pueblo Revolt. And at the Pueblo Revolt, the Spaniards were kicked out of the whole Southwest, but they left their missions, and they left the fruit trees that they had planted there. So here, in places like the Hopi land, they've been planting from seed those fruit varieties for 400 years. So it's the longest case of genetic adaptation of old world fruits in the new world. It's a really interesting project they're doing up there. So they're propagating those fruit trees and distributing these lost varieties all over their area there. Okay, so now we're jumping over to Jordan, the country of Jordan, which is the most water-stressed nation on the planet, right? And you can see, again, this is an area that receives, in the 0 to 3%, up to 3 inches a year. Hyper arid area near the Dead Sea, one of the lowest zones in the world. And so here you can see what the landscape looks like, barren, but we have a slope here, and you can see they've put in these swales for water collection, putting in a lot of hardy nitrogen-fixing trees to create the environment to put in orchards. And this is a project by the Permaculture Research Institute, and this is now what that looked like at one point. I think I have an even more recent picture. And I mean, look at the surrounding areas. This is what this looked like. But because they did water harvesting, and then they did nitrogen-fixing species, and then they did composting, and they brought all these elements together, they were able to shift the whole thing into a regenerative landscape, as opposed to a depleted landscape. This is another housing development that was built from scratch. So the ones that are built from scratch are like kind of the cream of the crop in a way, because it was all thought out beforehand. So this is in Tucson, Arizona. This is called Milagro. And Milagro, they bought a 50-acre property on this ridge right outside Tucson here. And so where a normal development would have gone and spread all these houses across, and everybody would have had their own driveway and their own garage and everything, they clustered the housing here on the top of this ridge. They clustered all the parking underneath these solar paneled parking structures here. And they made a walking community that has a lot of really interesting features. Well, first off, we talked about permaculture site analysis. So, they had their cold winds from the north. They've got their winter sun from the rising in the southeast, staying low on the horizon, setting in the southwest. Southwest prevailing summer winds. And then the summer sun rising in the northeast, staying high on the sky, and setting in the northwest. So they saw all of that, and that was what their community was responding to, right? So wait for those things to go away. So you can see how lush inside the community is compared to the surrounding desert. And so they saw the sun, so sun-wise, they oriented the entire community here to the southeast, right? So the whole thing is like facing southeast, yet individual buildings are facing south. They all have a long south side for good passive solar gain inside those buildings. And then on the north side of the buildings, they created these little shade pockets throughout. And then all of the water from the entire community was drained from the rooftops into the center of the community, right? So instead of sending the water out, they went and they put the water right in the middle of this development. So if you think about Tucson having an average annual rainfall of about 12 inches a year, right? But if you count the roof space and you take all of this 12 inches a year, 12 inches a year, 12 inches a year, you take all of this roof space and plus all the water falling on the center space and you concentrate it in the middle, then you have way more than 12 inches of rain falling a year in that oasis. You might have 30 inches a year, falling in there. You might multiply it by several times, right? Not only that, they took the wastewater from the community, they ran it through a wetlands treatment facility down here, and then they piped it back up to use as irrigation inside the community, right? So they created this really lush area that doesn't use any more water than any other surrounding zones. So think about that. What type of microclimate did they create on the top of this ridge in the desert, right? Where's the nicest place to be in the desert? They created a canyon, right? In a sense, they created a canyon because they have these are 2-story buildings, the canyon walls. They concentrated all the rainwater and the recycled gray water inside here, and they created the condition. Whoops, wrong direction. Sorry. They created. Whoa. Oh no. Yeah. Okay, this is going to take a little while. They created the conditions inside that you'd find in a nice, shady, protected microclimate. And really, when we think of dry lands, we think of being inside a shady, sheltered canyon as the very nicest place to be. So, yeah. I experienced something very interesting when I changed my slides to Keynote here, is that these animations take exceptionally long to do, and you can't seem to fast forward. So we'll all just take a deep breath here. Has anybody here spent time down in Tucson? Yeah. So Tucson is really that's where I studied permaculture at first. Tucson is one of the epicenters of permaculture in the US and in the Southwest. And a lot of it, of course, has to do with water harvesting. And so my teacher who helped to design this building here, this whole structure, he actually has been working in Tucson for over 25 years and has actually had a lot of the laws changed now where the city itself is doing a ton of water harvesting off of roads. So this is his house here, and this is a Google Earth image, and this is right in a neighborhood in Tucson, Arizona. But you can see this doesn't look like a really depleted, dry area. This looks like a fairly lush landscape. So he harvests all of the water that falls on every part of this landscape to feed the landscape. Also, water from adjacent roads is harvested into this. So when they get the monsoon rains, they've cut the curb and dug basins. So those monsoon rains come and fill up these basins. And all the different areas within his site are collecting that rainwater. So on a 1/8 of an acre site, he's harvesting over 100,000 gallons of water a year, soaking it in. And it's created this lush landscape. And now, I mean, this thing is so lush, it's been featured in like many TV shows and landscape architecture magazines, and everybody comes to this one little small site that's actually been done well. So it's pretty astounding. Again, in the dry lands here, so this is not new. This is actually what permaculture, this is ancient permaculture right here. And this is a food forest in Morocco, in this valley. It's 2,000 years old. So at the valley bottom, we find this whole giant matrix of date palms, bananas, olive trees. There's just tons and tons of fruits. And because this is such a really sunny, hot area, it's really very feasible there to do this intensive multi-story gardening where a lot of these tender plants that you wouldn't necessarily imagine surviving well in Morocco do well in the understory of these palms and such, right? So then we move over to India. Now, this is not an actual picture. This is a picture of a model of what Oroville is meant to be. Now, Oroville was founded 50 years ago, prior to anybody coming up with the word permaculture. And this is, I'm actually going to be here next month. And it was founded as a global peace city. And they started out, it was this Indian guru and his French disciple. And this is an area that was colonized by France and was kept as a French colony for a very long time, even after the British had already left India. And so they found this dry savanna, and they started planting trees and doing water harvesting, and with the plan to create this city. And this is what it looks like now. You can kind of see the pattern. You still have this sort of spiral pattern that you saw there. But this was all, there was no trees here, right? They reforested this entire region. They created these brilliant forests, basically using the same types of practices and principles we're talking about with permaculture, with water harvesting, selecting adaptive species, getting nitrogen-fixing species, and working with the ecology to create forest from, like a forest succession from this very depleted landscape. So examples like this that are 50 years old show like, look, this is not, you can actually take depleted landscapes and you can turn them into really verdant and rich places, right? So 2 years ago, I went to India for the International Permaculture Conference that was hosted by Narsana and Padma Coppola. And about 600 permaculture people from all over the world came to this conference, as well as many, many people from throughout India. And Bill Mollison, I was talking about how he went to all these different places in the world. So he came to the Deccan Plateau back in the early 80s. And Narsana was one of his students. So now we are, you know, between 30 and 40 years after that, and Narsana now is a, you know, gray-haired, wizened man. And so I'm going to show you the site, one of the sites that they developed. That's one of the oldest, you know, again, we have things that are indigenous systems, and then we have things that are, you know, capital P permaculture in quotes. So this is the oldest site in India that is a permaculture site that really is merging indigenous wisdom with some of the modern techniques that Bill Mollison taught. So this is the site right here. And I wanted to show you, start with the zoomed out view, because you can see the surrounding area, what it looks like. This is a plateau. And then where we see fields, this is the valley. This is an arid landscape. This is in the middle, the interior of the continent. So it's really, they don't get a lot of precipitation. They get the monsoons and that's it. And they don't get as much monsoons as many areas. So the government felt like this whole area was only sufficient for like low grade eucalyptus forestry. So that's what we see there surrounding. And then as we zoom in, so basically they created, this is their educational center that they created. And each of these tree lines are planted on water harvesting swales, right? So you have to remember, a climate like this is a monsoonal climate, which means that they get all of their rainfall during the monsoon period. So it could be a 2 to 4 month period, usually on the lower side here, so probably like 3 months, that there's a lot of rain, and then it's bone dry for another 9 months. So in a place like this, the strategy is you have to collect, and you get tons of water all at once. So you have to collect as much of the water as you can when it comes. And so this is not a big site, right? This is something like, I think it's 9 acres. And they have fields where they're doing annual cropping in here, right? So these are their production fields, and their fields are surrounded on all sides by hedgerows to protect from desiccating winds and also for diverse tree crops. And then they've got the cropping systems here. Everything is planted on swales. So just even on a site this size, with the water harvesting on this scale, they went from digging a hand well and having no groundwater, or having groundwater for just a small part of the year, to having consistent year-round groundwater on this site. So they just at this scale, on the 9 acres of water harvesting, they built their groundwater reserves enough that they had water that they could pump up and use for irrigation. And they didn't even establish this site with irrigation. They planted thousands of trees, and they said something like they had like 80% loss, but they kept planting and planting, and the ones that survived in those water harvesting swales got their roots down there and were able to survive. And then when the rains did come, it was able to restore the water table here. They do a lot of, so this is that site there. They do a lot of composting, and they also are teaching all of the villagers around there permaculture in this whole region, especially like widows. You know, they're a Gandhian-based organization, so they're very socially conscious, and they get widows and people who are kind of dispossessed, give them an acre, teach them permaculture, and that's kind of their model there. Biogas. So I see all over India and other places, Cuba as well, I saw all over Cuba, they're taking all the farm waste, and they're putting it in these kind of fermentation underground containers with a bladder, and they're harvesting the gas, the methane coming off, and they're fueling the kitchen with the waste. And this is common in many parts of the world. So well, maybe this is too much of a tangent, but I'll take a 30-second tangent. You get survey calls, and sometimes it seems like the survey call is actually trying to manipulate your opinion instead of getting a survey. But I had a very interesting, it worked. I had a very interesting survey call from, it was a natural gas survey, and they were like, how do you feel about people passing laws to ban natural gas in new developments? Because apparently that's a thing. And I was like, that seems like a good thing, I don't know. But they were like, what about using the pipelines to tap into renewable natural gas sources like landfills, right? And I was like, well, that's a good idea, because that's what these people are doing on a small scale. There's a mini landfill underneath in this bladder that they're tapping natural gas for. And so if the natural gas coming in my home could be from a giant covering over a landfill, I think that would be a wonderful thing. But this is common, and we see this intercropping. I think this is turmeric. Intercropping, so we see nitrogen-fixing plants surrounding perennial and agricultural cropping fields. We see lots of different mixed multi-storied fruits, and this is all in this microclimate that they've created. We see animals, right? This is the buffalo, right? A lot of these buffalo in India you find, and they milk them for milk. So everybody, like all of these, the other interesting thing is all of these are vegetarian. These are Hindu areas. Lots of animals across the landscape. I mean, lots of cows, lots of goats, everything. None of it's for meat. All of it's for cheese and milk. And then every farm has this incredibly utilitarian structure that I saw, right? And I was like, what is that thing? You guys like break dancing, or what are you doing there? It's all seed cleaning, winnowing. So having a concrete slab with a little curb around it is like an essential component and an economic investment for a poor farmer for being able to process your seed, process your grains. Okay, so now this is the most fascinating story for me. So then I spent 2 months in India. I'm actually going back in 16 days for we're going to spend 50 days in India documenting large-scale rainwater harvesting systems. So this was my first taste. So this is up in Rajasthan. This is a desert that is about the same climate as Phoenix, Arizona, but a little bit hotter, if you can imagine, and more rain in a shorter period of time. So they have like 2 months or less of rainfall, where they get between 4 and 12 inches in a year in about a 2-month period, and then they have no precipitation the entire rest of the year with temperatures hotter than Phoenix, Arizona. Okay, so this is like harsh climate. And I was there during the dry season. So anything you see that's green in these pictures is because of irrigation, right? So we're standing on this rocky slope, and you can see there's a wall behind us there. This wall is it's a field boundary, but it's the first line of defense where when they get those monsoons, I mean, you imagine they get gushing water coming off those rock structures, and it breaks the fall of that water, this rock wall. This is one of their indigenous technologies. And then behind it, they have a water harvesting swale, and it begins to soak in the water. And then the overflow from that swale goes down here, and it hits the next water harvesting berm. All of the field boundaries are actually water harvesting structures. So this is an overhead of that site. So we've got these rocky hilltops here, and all the water comes down, and it hits this wall, which then overflows into this swale, which then floods successively each field down, and each field has a berm dividing field from field, right? And so they're soaking the water into the ground, and then it's enough water to pull out to grow a crop. Now, prior to doing this water harvesting work, they would grow one crop a year. They'd have the monsoons come, and that was all the rain they got. They'd plant, and if they had a failed monsoon, people would begin to starve, and people would migrate to the cities. So that's why we have mega cities like New Delhi that has about almost 30 million people, Mumbai that has 22.5 million people. But what the water harvesting did here is it put water into the ground, so they had a groundwater reserve where they could actually then pump out and grow a second crop. Now for these people, in the time, this is the second crop you're seeing. So the second crop is the difference between needing to migrate if you have a crop failure or being able to stay on your land. So it's super significant. This is just another little farm I visited here, and you can see this is a pond right here. And this pond, so this is all this water is coming off of this rocky slope, and then it's being channeled into this pond by these water harvesting swales right here. They're moving the water into this pond. And then this pond is building the groundwater reserves so they could pump water out right here and water these fields. So these are like very localized, very simple systems. That's what this pond actually looks like. And then the animals then come to the pond to drink. And it's literally the difference between people having to migrate or being able to stay in their place. And then there's a lot of other layers. So we're just talking about the water layer. They're also storing grains and fodder and firewood. There's a whole system that you would call permaculture. In fact, the guy, I made some videos on this place, and the guy I was talking to, he's like, this is permaculture. He's like, this is real permaculture. You know, and he didn't only learn the word a little while ago, but he understands that what they have is a permanent, resilient system. And you see all these large ponds, none of it is done with machinery, right? All of it is done by hand. Hundreds of people, thousands of people, one bowl at a time. And there's nobody you see working harder than the women. I mean, the women in this society are like doing the manual labor. It's really intense. And so I have a few more minutes, and so I'm kind of at the end, but I'm going to tell you one of the coolest stories that I think in the world related to this project. So there is this Indian movie star. Now, the movie stars in India are even bigger than the movie stars in the US, because there's 1.2 billion people there, right? And so this guy's like the Tom Cruise of India, okay? His name's Amir Khan, and he's a mega movie star. And he had some show that he was doing, like, interviewing people, and he found out about the water crisis, and he found out that there was villages like this that had actually solved the water crisis through small-scale water harvesting structures throughout the community, building their groundwater tables. And so he started a contest, right? And this is 2016, he started this contest to see which villages could build the most amount of water harvesting structures in a 45-day period. So they started in 2016, they had something like 125 villages compete. By 2019, the one that they had this year in the spring, they had 4,700 villages compete, right? And there's a huge prize. Like the prize is for the number one village is something like the equivalent of like $5 million, which is a lot of money for these villages, right? So and because he's a movie star, and because movie stars are almost revered there, like on the God level, because people are so into the movies that they're just really identify with the movie stars. So if you're like a lead charming guy who dances around and sings all that stuff, you're really like elevated. So they were able to inspire these people and create all this media around it. And so now, like I said, they had almost 5,000 villages compete, and they're doing this every year. And it's like, they've sort of tapped into a way in their particular society to create this mass movement, and people are it's like as soon as the thing starts, they're like 11:59, 12 o'clock, and like thousands of people go out with picks and they rush out and they start building, and they hold like 24-hour vigils to build these water harvesting structures all by hand, and then only one season later, they begin to see the results because they're restoring the water table. I mean, it happens that quickly, right? So anyway, that's the end of that last little story. So thank you very much. For anybody that likes, one sec, I'll just show you two. For anybody that likes online courses, I have a permaculture design course through OSU for non-credit. And also there's a link to my podcast if anybody wants to copy that down while we're doing questions. Yeah? Did I go too long?
No, we probably are not going to have questions.
Okay.
But Gwen Ellen just told me that she would send out all of your slides online.
Okay.
For people, or any information how to contact you.
Great. Awesome.
Okay. And I just want to make an announcement for all of you that if you have friends, relatives, neighbors that would be interested in this subject, he is going to be speaking tonight to the Master Gardeners at Chemeketa Community College, Building 8, Room 201. It's all free, and there are light refreshments. So. So come and have them hear this wonderful presentation that we heard this afternoon. A little bit abbreviated, but it will be similar. So thank you very much.